There is a mountain in the southern Urals that does not appear on most Russian maps. It rises about 1,700 meters above the forests of Bashkortostan, and from the air, in winter, it looks like any other peak in that range. It is not. For most of the 1990s, satellite photographs taken by American intelligence showed something that did not match the geology. Heavy trucks moving up a road that officially did not exist. Concrete shipments in volumes that no civilian project would explain. Ventilation shafts that climbed straight up the slope and ended in low grey buildings painted to match the snow. Yamantau. In Bashkir, the name translates roughly as Evil Mountain. The Russian government has confirmed, over 30 years, almost nothing about what is inside it. The Americans, by the late 90s, were spending real money trying to find out. One leaked Pentagon estimate put the construction cost on the Russian side at over $6 billion. $6 billion to dig out a mountain that, officially, does not have anything inside it. That figure is where this list starts. Not at the top, at number 3. Because there are 9 other places governments spent comparable money to hide, and the one at number 1 is the one I think about at night. 10 places, 10 budgets, 10 silences. We are going to count down to the worst of them. The thing that connects these sites is not the money, although the money is staggering. It is not the geography, although every continent except South America is represented before we are finished. It is the gap between what was spent and what was admitted to. You can hide a building, you can hide a base. What is harder to hide is the line in a national budget that says, for 30 years, that $1 billion left the Treasury and did not go anywhere. Eventually, someone notices. These 10 cases are the ones where someone did. I'm going to tell you, by name, who noticed. I'm going to give you the years, the satellite passes, the leaked memos, the Stanford paper. And I'm going to save one for last, where the public information ran ahead of the official acknowledgement by about a decade, and then, in 2023, ran past it again. Stay with me on this. We start far from home. Number 10. In the flat country east of Cambridge, in the English county of Suffolk, there is an airbase called RAF Mildenhall. It looks from the road like an ordinary military airfield. Tarmac, hangars, a perimeter fence. The local pub a mile down the lane has been pouring pints to American airmen since 1950. The base has been operated by the United States Air Force since the Cold War. That part is not hidden. What was hidden, for almost 20 years, was a building inside the perimeter that had no windows and a roof bristling with what looked like white golf balls. Radomes, each one covering a satellite dish pointed at a specific angle into space. The program was called ECHELON. The first published reference came from a New Zealand researcher named Nicky Hager in 1996, in a book the British government tried, briefly, to stop. ECHELON, according to Hager, was a global signals intelligence network operated jointly by the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The 5 countries called themselves the Five Eyes. The stations they ran, Mildenhall in England, Menwith Hill on the Yorkshire Moors, Pine Gap in Central Australia, vacuumed up satellite communications across most of the planet. Phone calls, faxes, early email traffic, telexes between embassies. The Mildenhall site, in particular, was responsible for European and Middle Eastern traffic. Every transatlantic call out of Frankfurt, every cable from Cairo, every telex from a Soviet embassy in Madrid. Through the 1980s, the British Parliament was repeatedly told that no such program existed. The Americans, when asked, declined to comment on intelligence matters. The budget for the Mildenhall expansion in those years ran into the high hundreds of millions of pounds, paid for out of a line item that read, on the publicly available accounts, as airfield maintenance. The specific detail is this. In 1972, an electrician named Cyril Watts, working on a contract for the British Ministry of Public Buildings, was sent to wire a new structure at Mildenhall. The structure had no plans on file at the local council, which was illegal under British construction law. When Watts asked for the plans, he was told to wire the building from his own drawings and not to keep copies. He kept them anyway, in a tin in his garden shed. They were found by his son in 2004. The drawings showed 27 antenna mounts, all oriented within a 2-degree arc, pointed at the geostationary belt above the Atlantic. The official explanation, when ECHELON finally surfaced in the European Parliament in 2001, was that the system was used to monitor terrorism and the proliferation of weapons. The committee report, which ran to 194 pages, concluded that the program also intercepted commercial communications between European companies and their American competitors. No one was prosecuted. Number 9. About 50 kilometers north of the Pennsylvania state border with Maryland, near the town of Blue Ridge Summit, there is a mountain called Raven Rock. It is not a high mountain. It is not a famous mountain. If you drove past it on Route 16, you would notice nothing, only a sign at the foot of an access road that reads Site R, restricted area, no photography. What is inside Raven Rock is a small city. Construction began in 1951 under President Truman and finished under Eisenhower in 1953. The official designation is the Raven Rock Mountain Complex. Internally, in the documents that leaked across the 1970s and 1980s, it is called Site R. Built into the granite of the ridge are 5 3-story buildings, a power plant, a water reservoir, a hospital, and a communications center that connects directly to the Pentagon, 60 miles to the south. The purpose of Site R is to be the place the United States government runs from if Washington is destroyed. A redundant capital, a second White House, hollowed out of a hillside with its own zip code. The budget for the original construction, declassified in 1995, was $18 million in 1951 currency, roughly $220 million in modern terms. The expansion budgets, the upgrades through the 1980s under the Reagan administration, post-9/11 hardening, Site R has consumed, by conservative estimates, more than $4 billion across its lifetime. Most of those budgets were buried in the line item for general military construction. The man who ran the site in the early 1960s was a lieutenant colonel named Harold Pearson. In a letter to his sister, written in the spring of 1962 and held now in the Carlisle archives, he described his work in only this much detail. "I cannot tell you what I do, except that I sleep 2 miles under a hill, and when I come up on Sundays, I am surprised the sun still exists." The specific detail is the elevators. There are 4, original to the build. Each takes 90 seconds to descend from the surface to the lowest operating floor. According to a 2003 magazine piece by the journalist William Arkin, who got further inside than any other civilian, the elevators have a smell to them: old oil and pine. The pine, Arkin was told, is from the timbers used to brace the shaft in 1951. Pennsylvania white pine, cut from the very ridge that buried it. It is still in there, holding up the most important elevator shaft in the American government. What happens in number 5 makes this case look ordinary. You may already be seeing the pattern. The pattern is underground. When a government wants to hide something on the open ground, it puts up a fence. When it wants to hide something for 50 years, it digs. Every site so far has been buried, or partly buried, or built behind concrete thick enough to defeat ground-penetrating radar. The technology of secrecy in the second half of the 20th century was the technology of digging. We have not yet reached the deepest of these holes. That comes later. Number 8. In Colorado, about 15 kilometers southwest of the city of Colorado Springs, there is a mountain called Cheyenne. It is granite. It rises about 900 meters above the surrounding plain. Inside it, behind a pair of 25-ton blast doors, is one of the most secure command centers ever built by any government. The Cheyenne Mountain complex was carved out between 1961 and 1966 at a publicly stated cost of $142 million in 1966 money, close to $1.5 billion in today's terms. It was designed to survive a 30-megaton thermonuclear strike at a distance of 3 kilometers. The 15 buildings inside it sit on more than 1,000 steel springs, each weighing nearly half a ton, so that the structure can sway independently of the rock when the mountain itself is moved by a blast. Buildings that float on springs, inside a mountain. The first operational mission of the complex, in 1966, was North American Aerospace Defense, NORAD. Its job was to watch the sky over the polar cap for incoming Soviet missiles. The men and women who worked there, on 12-hour shifts in windowless rooms, lived inside the mountain for stretches of 3 days at a time. They called it, in their own slang, the hole. The detail that stays with me comes from a 1973 internal report, leaked in fragments through the 1990s. The report described an incident from November of 1979 in which a training tape, a simulation of a full Soviet attack, was by error run on the live operational system. For about 6 minutes, the screens in the Cheyenne hole showed 2,020 Soviet missiles inbound across the Arctic. The duty officer that night was a colonel named William Odom. He did not initiate retaliation. He did not, in fact, do anything except call the Pentagon and ask, in a voice the transcript describes as quiet, whether anyone else was seeing what he was seeing. It took 11 minutes to confirm the tape was the source. During those 11 minutes, the entire American nuclear posture was held in suspension by a man who had decided, on his own, to wait. The budget for Cheyenne Mountain since 1966, including renovations after the complex was nearly shuttered in the 2000s and then reopened in 2015 as a hardened backup to NORAD's newer headquarters at Peterson Air Force Base, has run cumulatively to between $3 and $4 billion. Most of that money is hidden in line items called classified procurement. Number 7. We move now to Switzerland, to a town called Lucerne, on the lake of the same name, and to a tunnel underneath a road. The Sonnenberg tunnel was completed in 1976 as part of a routine motorway expansion. It is 1.5 kilometers long. It runs east to west through the Sonnenberg Ridge. Traffic, on a normal weekday, passes through it without incident. What the traffic does not know is that the tunnel is also, by law, a nuclear shelter for the entire population of the city of Lucerne. 20,000 people, 16,500 bunk beds, stacked in modular dormitories, can be installed in the breakdown lanes within 24 hours by Swiss civil defense. This is not a secret in Switzerland. By federal law, dating to 1963, every Swiss citizen has a guaranteed bunker place. The total bunker capacity of the country exceeds 9 million spaces, more than the population. The Sonnenberg, when it was built, was the largest civil shelter in the world. The structure was called internally Shelter 12, after its administrative number in the Federal Civil Defense Registry. The cost of construction in 1976 francs was just over 40 million, modern equivalent around $150 million. That is the publicly reported figure. The detail the Swiss government has never quite explained is this. In 1987, a planned full-scale test of the shelter system, meant to seal the tunnel doors, activate the ventilation, and run the facility for 1 full week, was abandoned after 3 days. The 4 blast doors, each weighing 350 tons, could not all be closed simultaneously. The hydraulic systems were not synchronized. According to a federal report, leaked to the newspaper Tages-Anzeiger in 1989, only one of the 4 doors could be sealed at any one time. 20,000 people would have been protected by a tunnel with 3 open ends. The doors were replaced over the next decade at a cost the federal government has, to this day, refused to itemize. The figure that appears in the leaked 2003 audit is 290 million francs, for a tunnel that, officially, is a place where cars drive between Bern and Lucerne. What was hidden in number 1 makes every shelter ever built look like a wooden shed. I keep coming back to that phrase from the audit, refused to itemize. When a government refuses to itemize, it is rarely because there is nothing to say. It is because the items, listed separately, would tell a story the government does not want told. The story so far is small. Surveillance towers in Suffolk, a buried capital in Pennsylvania, a swaying city under a Colorado mountain, a motorway tunnel that is also a fortress. Each one expensive, each one denied for a long time, each one, eventually, partly known. We are about to leave the West. Number 6. In northeastern Kazakhstan, on a plateau that locals call the Steppe of Death, there is a place that does not appear on Soviet maps until 1991. Before that, the area is a blank rectangle, larger than the country of Belgium, labeled only Restricted Zone. The Russians, in 1947, called it Semipalatinsk 21. Internally, in the documents of the Soviet atomic program, it was the Polygon. The Polygon was the principal nuclear testing site of the Soviet Union, and between 1949 and 1989, it was the site of 456 confirmed nuclear detonations, above ground, underground, in the air, dropped from bombers. The first Soviet atomic bomb, the RDS-1, codenamed First Lightning, was tested at the Polygon on the 29th of August 1949, in the grey hour before sunrise. The director then was a physicist named Igor Kurchatov. The Soviet government did not, for nearly 40 years, acknowledge that the testing was happening near a populated area. There were villages around the perimeter of the Polygon, towns of 2,000, 3,000 people, downwind of the test pads. Children attended schools that, by the 1980s, sat in measurable fallout zones. The villages were called, in internal documents, the Kazakh research population. The word that appears in those documents is research. The cost of the program across 40 years ran into the tens of billions of rubles. At the official exchange rate of the time, an estimate of around $20 billion in modern money. Most of it was buried inside the budget of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, which was the Soviet euphemism for atomic weapons. The detail comes from a 1957 report by a young Soviet doctor named Saim Balmukhanov. He had been sent into one of the perimeter villages to take blood samples from the children. In his official report, filed in Moscow, he wrote that the samples were normal and the population healthy. In his personal notebook, which his granddaughter released to the Kazakh National Archives in 2008, he wrote a single sentence in the margin of that day's page. They have no eyebrows, none of them. Children, mothers, the old men. None of them have eyebrows. He never explained in any later document what he had seen. The Polygon was officially closed on the 29th of August, 1991, by the first president of independent Kazakhstan on the 42nd anniversary of the first detonation. The cleanup is ongoing. The land, in places, will not be safe for 10,000 years. Number 5. In the mountains of Chagang province, in the north of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, there is a peak the locals call Mupyong. About 15 kilometers from its summit, on a road that ends at a checkpoint, satellite photographs taken by the American intelligence community in the early 2010s began to show something that had not been there in the 1990s. A pair of tunnel entrances, wide enough for a transporter-erector launcher vehicle, reinforced on each side with concrete revetments. Above them, the mountain itself. The site, designated by American analysts as Hwasong 9 by 2017, is one of at least 11 hardened missile bases the North Korean government has built into the granite of the country's interior. The Hwasong 9, named after the medium-range ballistic missile system housed there, sits more than 200 meters under solid rock. The launchers are wheeled out at night. They roll along internal rail tracks to one of 3 pre-surveyed firing positions on the southern slope. After firing, they roll back inside. A mountain that fires missiles. The North Korean government has never acknowledged the existence of the Hwasong 9 base. The construction is believed to have begun in 2004 and continued for at least a decade. The cost has been estimated by the South Korean Defense Ministry's 2018 white paper at over $1 billion, a staggering figure for a country whose entire annual GDP at the time was somewhere around $30 billion. The detail that stops me is from a 2019 paper by the American analyst Joseph Bermudez. Bermudez has been reading commercial satellite photography of North Korea since the 1980s. He noticed, in the Hwasong 9 images, that the snowfall on the southern slope of the mountain melted in a pattern that did not match the slope. There were vertical lines of bare rock running down the mountain. Bermudez concluded the lines were heat traces. The internal ventilation of the facility was warm enough, in winter, to melt snow on the outside of the mountain. The mountain was breathing. He published the photographs in a quiet, peer-reviewed journal. The North Korean government did not respond. The American government did not respond. The mountain is still there. It is still warm. Number 4. In the Nevada desert, about 130 kilometers north of Las Vegas, there is a dry lake bed called Groom Lake. Around it, since 1955, has stood an airfield the federal government did not officially admit existed until 2013. Most of you know it by its other name, Area 51. The site was selected in 1955 by a CIA officer named Richard Bissell. He had been tasked, under President Eisenhower, with finding a place to test fly the U-2, a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft designed to overfly the Soviet Union at altitudes that no Soviet interceptor could reach. Bissell flew over Groom Lake in a small plane in April of 1955 and chose it that afternoon. It was flat. It was remote. It was inside an existing nuclear test range, which meant the airspace above it was already restricted. Construction began that summer. By July of 1955, the first U-2 had taken off from the lakebed. What started as a runway in the desert has become, over 70 years, one of the most expensive single airfields in human history. The cumulative budget for Groom Lake, across every project that has used it, the U-2, the A-12, the SR-71, the F-117 Nighthawk, the B-2 Spirit, programs whose names are still classified, has been estimated by the historian Annie Jacobson in her 2011 book at well over $30 billion in modern currency. The annual operating budget, leaked through the Snowden documents in 2013, ran in that year alone to nearly $1 billion. The men and women who work there commute from Las Vegas on a fleet of unmarked Boeing 737s registered to a shell company called Janet Airlines. The planes take off from a private terminal at McCarran International Airport at exactly 6:15 a.m. and 6:45 a.m. every weekday. The detail is the test pilots. According to a 2014 oral history compiled by an aviation historian named Peter Merlin, the test pilots at Groom Lake have, since the 1960s, kept a small bar inside one of the hangars. Above the bar hangs a wooden propeller, painted black. The propeller does not belong to any aircraft anyone there can identify. It is older than the base. It was found, according to the oral history, in the desert by a survey team in 1954, before construction began. It is, by visual measurement, about 3 meters across. No one knows what aircraft it was for. No one removes it. Every test pilot, at the end of their tour, signs the back of the propeller. There are, in 2014, more than 400 signatures. The names of about half of them remain classified. The top 3 is a different category. So far, the budgets have run individually into single-digit billions. The cases have been hidden in plain sight, and the hiding eventually has cracked. ECHELON has been confirmed. Site R is on a tour list. Cheyenne Mountain has its own visitor information page. From here on, the doors are not open. The next 3 sites have not been visited by any independent observer. The budgets are estimated, not audited. The structures are real. Satellite photography proves they exist, but their interiors are reconstructed from leaks, defectors, and the inferences of analysts who have spent careers staring at grey pixels and trying to guess what is inside. These are the ones the money was meant to bury. Number 3. We return to where we began, Yamantau in Bashkortostan in the southern Urals. A mountain that does not appear on most Russian maps. The mountain the Russian government has never confirmed contains anything at all. The first American satellite confirmations of activity at Yamantau came in 1992. A team of analysts at the Defense Intelligence Agency, working under the direction of an officer named Phil Carber, were tracking heavy construction equipment moving in the southern Urals in volumes that matched no known civilian project. The road being built up the side of the mountain was wide enough for trucks Russia had only used, historically, to move the largest nuclear warheads. The concrete shipments, 20,000 tons in a single month at the peak of activity, would have been sufficient to pour a structure roughly the size of the District of Columbia inside the mountain. A city the size of Washington, hollowed out under a peak in the Urals. The cost estimate, leaked to the New York Times by an unnamed Pentagon source in April of 1996, was over $6 billion in then-current money. Adjusted to today, that figure is closer to $12 billion. The construction continued, in fits and starts, through the 1990s. It continued through the financial collapse of 1998, when the Russian state was unable to pay pensioners and Yamantau still received its concrete. The Russian government has, across 30 years, offered three different explanations. In 1996, asked directly by an American journalist, a spokesman for the Russian Ministry of Defense said Yamantau was a mining facility for non-ferrous metals. In 2007, a different spokesman said it was a storage facility for the Federal Grain Reserve. In 2018, a third spokesman said it was a closed research city and refused to take further questions. The journalist who pressed hardest on the story across the late 1990s was an American named Bill Gertz. In a 1996 article in the Washington Times, he reported that the inner complex was believed to be deep enough to survive a direct hit by an American peacekeeper missile. The chambers, he wrote, were estimated at 400 meters below the summit, about a quarter of a mile of solid granite overhead. The detail comes from a 2002 piece in the Russian newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda. A retired Russian engineer, who gave his name only as Mikhail Pavlovich, told the paper that he had worked at Yamantau in 1994 for 14 months. He had been told he was building ventilation systems for a mining complex. He stopped believing this on the day his foreman, drunk in the canteen, told him that the ventilation specifications were rated for what he called airtight occupancy of 60,000 people for 60 years. Mikhail Pavlovich asked the foreman to repeat the figure. The foreman said it twice. The article ran on a Tuesday. By Friday, Komsomolskaya Pravda had retracted it. The retraction said the engineer had been mistaken. He may have been. The retraction did not explain what the correct figure was. The construction at Yamantau, according to the most recent open-source analysis by the Federation of American Scientists in 2022, is ongoing. Number 2. In September of 2011, a graduate student at Georgetown University, working under a professor named Philip Carber, the same Carber from the 1992 Yamantau team, released a report. The report was based on 3 years of analysis of Chinese-language military journals, openly available online, that the rest of the Western analytical community had not been reading. The student's name was Tong Zhao. The report, which ran to 363 pages, concluded that the People's Liberation Army of China had, since the 1980s, built a network of tunnels for the storage, transport, and operational deployment of its nuclear forces. The network ran under at least 5 mountain ranges, primarily in central and western China. Its total length was estimated, on the basis of the Chinese military's own published technical articles, at 4,800 kilometers. The Chinese called it Changcheng Gongcheng, the underground Great Wall. A Great Wall, but under the ground. The report was picked up by the Washington Post in November of 2011. The Chinese government did not deny it. The Chinese government, in fact, never directly addressed it. A spokesman, asked at a regular press briefing, said only that the question fell outside the scope of public information. The estimated construction cost, assembled by Carber and Zhao from civilian engineering benchmarks in China, ran to between $80 and $120 billion across 30 years. Spread across hundreds of separate projects, each one disguised in the regional budgets of provincial military districts. No single line item exists. The detail in the Kaaba report that has stayed in my memory for 15 years is on page 217. Kaaba and Zhao identified, in the Chinese literature, references to ventilation systems sized for what the articles called extended garrison occupation. The numbers in the articles, when worked through, suggested that the tunnels were built to be lived in by missile crews for weeks at a time, possibly months. The arithmetic of how many crews at how many sites across how many tunnels came out in the Kaaba report to a figure between 2,000 and 3,000 warheads. The American public estimate of the Chinese nuclear stockpile at the time was around 200, a factor of 10 difference hidden under 5 mountain ranges. The propeller above the bar at Groom Lake, with its 400 signatures, was bought by the desert in 1954. The propeller and the Kaaba report do not share a country, do not share a decade, do not share anything except this. Both of them are objects that exist, that you can touch or read, that no government has been able to explain. The propeller has no aircraft. The tunnels have no warheads on record. I find that more than the budgets, more than the satellite photographs, is what stays with me. Things sized for purposes nobody will name. We have one more. Number 1. In the central Alaskan interior, about 320 kilometers northeast of Anchorage, on a flat stretch of land between the village of Gakona and the Wrangell Mountains, there is a field of antennas. There are 180 of them. They stand in a precise grid, 15 by 12. Each antenna is 22 meters tall. The grid covers 33 acres of subarctic spruce that has been cleared, fenced, and surrounded by a single-lane access road that, until 2014, was patrolled 24 hours a day by armed United States Air Force personnel. The site is called the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, HAARP. It was built between 1993 and 2007 under joint funding from the US Air Force, the US Navy, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and the University of Alaska. The publicly reported construction cost, across 14 years, was $290 million. The actual figure, including operating costs through 2014, is closer to $700 million. The official purpose of HAARP is to study the ionosphere, the upper layer of the atmosphere where charged particles from the Sun interact with Earth's magnetic field. The antennas, when fired in coordinated bursts, transmit radio waves of 3.6 megawatts into the ionosphere directly above the site. The ionosphere absorbs the waves. The instruments at Gakona measure what happens to the ionosphere when it does. This is the official version. It has been the official version since 1993. It is also, almost certainly, partly true. What is not yet known is what is not in it. In April of 2023, an investigative reporter named Sharon Weinberger, working for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, published the results of a 4-year Freedom of Information Act request. The documents she received included a series of internal Air Force memos from 1995 and 1996. The memos described, in technical language, experimental modes of HAARP that had not been publicly disclosed. One of those modes, designated in the memos by a single letter and a number, R7, involved focusing the full transmission of the array on a single point in the ionosphere for a sustained period. The memo does not say what the point of doing this was. The memo describes only that the test was conducted in February of 1996. The Air Force officer who signed the post-test report was a colonel named Edward Hennig. His report consists of 7 pages, 6 of which are technical measurements. The 7th page is a summary paragraph. The summary paragraph says, in full, that the test produced results consistent with the projected models of regional atmospheric response, and that further testing along this axis was suspended indefinitely on the recommendation of the program's Scientific Oversight Committee. The committee's report, Weinberger's documents reveal, was 11 pages long. 10 of those pages are still classified. The remaining page The only one cleared for release is the cover sheet. Underneath the printed title, in handwritten ink, are 2 lines. The first line reads, in the handwriting of the committee chair, a Stanford geophysicist named Umran Inan. It says, "We do not recommend repeating this until we understand what we did." The second line, in a different hand, reads, "The auroral display in Fairbanks that night was visible at noon." The site at Gakona was officially transferred from the Air Force to the University of Alaska in 2015. The university now runs it as a civilian research facility. The R7 mode, according to the released documentation, has not been used since February of 1996. What was hidden at Mount Yamantau was a city. What was hidden under 5 Chinese mountains was an arsenal. What was hidden in Suffolk was a wiretap on a continent. What was hidden in central Alaska is, by the description of the man who chaired the committee that signed off on it, something that the people running it did not understand. The committee chair, Umran Inan, retired in 2018. He has given 2 interviews since. Neither of them mentioned R7. When asked, on a podcast in 2021, what he most regretted about his career, he said only, in the same calm voice he used for technical lectures, that he wished some of the experiments had not worked. The auroral display in Fairbanks that night, on the 14th of February 1996, is on record in the local weather observations of the Fairbanks International Airport. The observation log notes, in the column for visibility, that Aurora was visible from the runway from approximately 11:40 in the morning until 12:14 in the afternoon. The sun, that day, rose at 8:53 and set at 16:38. The aurora is normally a feature of the night sky. That is the list. 10 places, 10 budgets. The total, across all 10, runs to something between $150 and $200 billion, depending on how generously the line items are read. Most of that money cannot be traced to any specific building, any specific contractor, any specific account. There is a phrase, in the language of government accounting, for budgets like these. They are called black. Not because they hide criminal activity, because the line that the money traveled on cannot be seen. A black line in a national budget is, in the end, the same shape as a tunnel under a mountain. Both are paths that the money walks down and that we are not allowed to follow. The propeller is still on the wall. The aurora was visible at noon, and the mountain in Bashkortostan tonight is still breathing.